We are in the middle of the נימוקי Yosef. So if you have the picture that I sent you, it's on the left-hand side where there's a little square brackets and it says Hey Amud Beis. So the last thing נימוקי Yosef told us is he framed the machlekes.
נימוקי you sent is Zion and Ches, no?
Yeah, Zion and Ches, yeah. So this is on page Zion, in the left-hand column. There's a little square bracket that says Hey with 2 dots. So the last thing נימוקי Yosef did for us is he framed the machlekes between Abaye and Rava, between Abaye and Rava and Reish Lakish. Abaye and Rava who said that a person would pay early. Reish Lakish said a person would never pay early. And he explained that the machlekes is specifically by a loan, because in the case of a loan, considering that the person Reuven did Shimon a favor, so there is when Abaye and Rava would say Shimon would want to pay him back, because there's a kind of embarrassment every time he sees Reuven, knowing that he owes him this money. But if it's, say, a renter, even Abaye and Rava would agree that a renter would not pay early, because why should he? He's not, he's paying, it's rent. There's no embarrassment in that he looks at his landlord, I'm going to pay you when time is up, when it's time to pay the date, time to pay, so there's no reason to pay early. So machlekes is specifically, in Rashi's word, b'malva sheholvo. That's where we are. So it says the נימוקי Yosef, upasak Talmuda, the Gemara paskind, the hilchas that the halacha is, Reish Lakish, following Reish Lakish, that a person would not pay early. And the Gemara said, ba'afilu miyasmi, even if he's collecting from orphans. Well, ordinarily the halacha is when someone collects money from an orphan, right? So Reuven owes Shimon money. Reuven dies. Shimon comes collecting from the children. So ordinarily, he'd have to take a vow that says that your father never paid me back. Shimon would have to take a shvua that Reuven never paid him back, and then he can collect money from the orphans. But in this case, where the father died early, as Rashi says it here, the נימוקי Yosef is quoting him, because the father died, Reuven died before the due date of the loan, the chazaka is that he did not pay hilchach, therefore nifra. Therefore, Shimon can collect, nifra hamalva, the one who lent, the Shimon can collect, mina yisevim from the orphans, even without taking a vow, which is not ordinary of the halacha. So now comes the נימוקי Yosef, and this is something that is against Tosafos. Tosafos had a whole long pilpul to disagree with the statement that נימוקי Yosef is about to make. נימוקי Yosef says, "V'skimu mefarshim zal," and the commentaries all agree that even if we're talking about orphans that are minors, he can still collect early. And this is not like Tosafos, right? We remember that we had 2 reasons why. One, right, the halacha is, Tosafos told us the halacha is that we don't take money from the estate of minors to pay off debt of their father unless the debt is collecting interest and they're losing money on that debt. Otherwise, leave it alone and wait for them to be adults. And we had 2 reasons for this. Either because they are not obligated to mitzvahs yet, and a loan is a mitzvah, or reason 2 is because perhaps the father set aside money to pay off this debt. And when they're older, they might go through the papers and find out that there's such money. So wait for them to get older. And Tosafos went on to say, well, if the reason is because they are not obligated to mitzvahs and paying back a loan is a mitzvah, then certainly, even if the creditors are coming before the due date, certainly the children wouldn't have to be paid back because they're not mechuyev mitzvahs yet. But even according to the other opinion, which says that the reason why you ordinarily don't collect from minors is because maybe the father set aside money, over here you might argue, well, the father certainly did not set aside money because it's a chazaka, a person doesn't pay early. And Tosafos went on a whole pilpul that maybe when it comes to young children, the father doesn't want to saddle his children with debt, and all kinds of explanations and all kinds of intellectual gymnastics that Tosafos was doing to make it such that the halacha is you don't collect from children until they grow up. And נימוקי Yosef just flat out says most disagree with that. And we do collect, if it's before the due date, then the creditors can come and collect because the assumption is the father did not pay. And here's how the נימוקי Yosef expresses it. And we are not concerned with Loimar saying David Inish that it's possible that a person might the mitzvah tsardi that'll stash a bundle Terzman early. We won't say that. So the נימוקי Yosef completely ignores the opinion which says that the issue with minors is that they're not obligated in mitzvahs. I'm assuming נימוקי Yosef is disregarding that because it's not the final halacha. I'm assuming because he doesn't address it. So let's just go with the fact that the reason why ordinarily you don't take money out of minors is because perhaps the father put aside money. And therefore, says the נימוקי Yosef, that even though we might say ordinarily a person will put away money, but just as a person would not pay early, likewise, a person doesn't stash a bundle to pay off a debt that's early. That's the whole point. A person doesn't pay back early. So if it's early, you can collect even from Yosem Tana. Because of Ramban Zal, and the Ramban writes, Dim Amar Loi Ters Manei, Ishtobali, the Loi Paraticha, Loi Mashbinan Lei. So what I think is referring to is ordinarily the halacha is that a person, if one person asks, Reuven asks Shimon, pay up, Shimon can say, you Reuven, you want me to pay? Take a shvua that I never paid you. And then we would turn to Reuven and say, okay, take that vow, unless there's Edim or whatever. But otherwise, he can say, okay, good, take the vow. Shimon doesn't believe you. He wants you to take a shvua. And if you take a shvua, you can then collect. Now, what if the person says that when he's coming to collect early? Says the Ramban that no one, we don't make him make a shvua because it's early and we assume he didn't pay yet. And therefore, Shimon can't come and say, oh, you think I didn't pay? Take a shvua, I didn't pay. Shimon can't make such a claim because it's too early to even assume that he might have paid. Okay. Now we come to an interesting discussion, something we touched upon a little bit when we learned the Gemara. And this has been Egeya to the Gemara's question. The Gemara's question was, the unresolved question is, if a person demands the money later, Tovil Achazman, after the due date, and Reuven says, I paid early, is he believed the migu that he could have said I paid on time? Or do we say, the chazaka is a person never pays early, and therefore we assume he never paid early. I have a migu, too bad. Made al chazaka, as Rashi says. He ruined his claim by saying that he paid early because it's contrary to the chazaka that a person does not pay early. So we didn't define exactly what la'achar zman means. What exactly does the Gemara mean that the person is coming to collect the debt after the due date? How long after? A week later, 2 days later, an hour later, a month later? We've not defined that. And this is now we left it kind of open, but now the נימוקי Yosef is going to get into some of the details, exactly what it means later. So Pirush Ramban Zal, the Ramban writes, the lav dafka la'achaz mane mamish. It does not necessarily mean literally sometime later that he comes and asking him for the money. To hu hadin, the same thing applies. B'yoyma de mishalim. Even if he comes to ask him for the money on the very day that he's supposed to pay, on that day, the same question applies. Zimna have a migu. B'yoyma mishalim zimani, I think it's what it is. Have a migu, there's still a migu. Di boy Amar, because he could have said, Particha achshav, I paid you just now. So I'm telling you I paid you a week ago. Reuven's saying I paid a week ago. The migu is I could have said I paid you now. So why do I have to wait for next week for this migu? Why can't I make the migu on the very day of the due date? What's the problem? Now says the Ramban, Ba'afagav, even though the Bestaber, it seems Taimayu Dahani da Amru, the opinion of those who disagree with the Ramban. And they say the lav migu hu klau, that it's not a migu. So the Ramban says, even on the very day, this is the נימוקי Yosef commenting on the Ramban. So the Ramban said that even on the very due date, the same migu applies. If Reuven said, I paid you last week, the same kasha, maybe you should believe in migu that I paid you now. But there are those that disagree with that and say, no, that's not a migu. What's their logic? Make sense? A person is embarrassed to say something that is so obviously and blatantly false to his creditor. In other words, if the guy said, I paid you a year ago. Migu, you should believe me, because I could have said I paid you 6 months ago. So it's not, even though they both know the truth, but Shimon can convince himself maybe Reuven forgot because it was 6 months ago. But I'm claiming that I paid you this afternoon. Like, it's such a blatant and obvious lie. I can't even convince myself that the guy doesn't know. And therefore, it's too bold a claim, and therefore they say this is not ambigu. So he doesn't say exactly how long later does this become ambigu, a week, a month, a year, it doesn't say exactly. But on that day, definitely not. Whereas the Ramban says, look, ambigu is ambigu, embarrassment, we don't care. The reality is he could have said something else. He could have said a better lie. He didn't. So the ambigu is ambigu. Whereas the others, I think it's the Ravid and others who say, no, it's too embarrassing and too bold to say, oh, I paid you this afternoon. That's too much. Okay, but nonetheless, so even though these are the guys, even though this is a sound logic, it's sound logic that a person that it's too bold to say I paid you this afternoon. Such a lie is too bold. But nonetheless, Kosav Harabzal, the Ramban still sticks to his opinion. Why is that? Because if you're of the view that on the day of you don't have a migu, and therefore that would mean therefore that the case of Reish Lakish, the original statement of Reish Lakish, the original case of Kaveh Zman, right? The opening statement of the Gemara, the opening machlokes of Abaye and Rava and Reish Lakish, and we'll stick to Reish Lakish's opinion because that's what we're dealing with here. So the original statement of Reish Lakish, which is that when Reuven sets a set time for Shimon to pay up, if he claims he paid early, we don't believe him. So that would mean, according to you, David, if you say there is no migo on the day of, motzi koi b'kahai gavna. So it would mean that it could be a case where the person is asking him to pay on time, and if he tells you, I paid a week ago, he's not believed, according to you, David. According to me, Ramban, this is not the case of Reish Lakish, because in that case, there's still the question, maybe there's a migo I paid you this afternoon. So we'll have to see what exactly is the case according to the Ramban. What's the case? What's the original case of the Reish Lakish, which says we don't believe a person when he says I paid early? When exactly is he being asked to pay? Well, he's being asked to pay earlier, as we'll see. But if on the day of you have no migu, because it's too embarrassing, too bold a claim to say I paid you today, then Reish Lakish is talking about a case where the person collected today. So therefore, the Gemara could have been talking about this case where Reuven's asking Shimon to pay on the due date, and Shimon is saying, I paid you last week, and that's when Reish Lakish says you're not believed. So then the Gemara should have stated so explicitly that even if the collection is being made on time, still Shimon cannot claim I paid early. Why? Because that would be a bigger chiddush. That would teach us a greater chiddush. The lo yamin and high migu. That you don't say this migu that I could have said I paid you today. In other words, like this, the Ramban is saying, even if your logic is sound, in that it is too bold a claim to say I paid you this afternoon or this morning. It's too bold a claim. Fine. And that's why you're saying it's not a migu. But you still have to agree that that is still a migu. Maybe it's too bold a migu, but it's still a migu, which would mean to tell me that you're not believed when you say that is a greater statement than to say you're not believed last week when you said you didn't pay last week, where you have no migu because it's earlier than the time. Now, if it's a greater chiddush, then you should have said that one explicitly. Following? Reish Lakish made a din, right? Reish Lakish said that one person, one who sets a time for his friend to pay up, and he comes to collect the money, and the other person said, I paid early, he's not believed. That was Reish Lakish's din. So when is Reuven asking for the money? If he's asking it of him on the due date, then that is a greater chiddush that he's not believed than if he'd asked him a week ago early. Because when he asked him early, the only counterclaim is, I paid you already early. So there's no migu here. But if Reuven is asking for the money on the due date, then there's two options that Shimon could say. Shimon could say, I paid you early, or Shimon could say, I paid you today. Even though I paid you today is a bold claim, but nonetheless, it's still a claim that could have been made. And therefore, when he says, I paid you last week, it's undermining the migu that I could have said I paid you today. If that's the case, it's a bigger chiddush to tell me that there's no such migu than it is to say that last week when I asked you for the money early and you said I paid you, that we don't believe you. Following? And therefore says the Ramban, if it's taka true that there is no such migu that I could have said I paid you today, if that migu doesn't exist, then Reish Lakish's din that a person isn't believed when he says I paid early should apply even when he's being asked to pay on time. And there would be a bigger chiddush here that he cannot say, amigo, I could have said I paid you today. Yeah, what are you gonna say?
But the problem with that is the whole thing of saying that it's such a blatant and bald-faced lie, so it could not be amigo, or we could not accept it for another reason, right? So then we don't have proof that whether it's migo or not.
That's true. So that's why I was saying that it would seem that the Ramban is saying, even if you're going to say it's a bold migu and therefore you don't believe it, but it's still a bigger chiddush than saying we don't believe it when you have no migu.
Right.
And therefore you should have said the bigger chiddush. That's the Ramban is saying. That's what I think he's saying. Right? So let's see how the נימוקי Yosef puts it. So the Im Isa, because if you're of the view that there's no such migu, I could have said I paid you today, then that would mean that this din of earlier, we're in Moshe, we're in the נימוקי Yosef on the left-hand column, the Dibur Maschel Tov Elachazman. So the hachtal then that would mean that this statement mentioned before at the beginning of the sugya, that Kaveh Azman, where Reish Lakish made the din that if a person set time to pay up, and Reish Lakish said that if Shimon says I paid you early, he's not believed. So Motzi Koi b'kahai gav Talmuda. The Gemara could have established it in such a scenario that Reuven is collecting on the due date. And Havle Lefusha Behedya, the Gemara should have said so explicitly, Lashminun Chadusha, to teach us a bigger Chiddush, Doloya Min and Hai Migu, that we don't say this Migu that I could have said I paid you today. And that would be a bigger Chiddush than if I Lechatchila came to collect early, in which case there is no Migu. Because your only option is to say you paid early. So, and נימוקי Yosef goes and elucidates further. Mishum de'ika debo, because there are those who ask. Hach de Reish Lakish. This case of Reish Lakish. For those who asked us, right? We were asking on the statement of La'achar Zman, when the Gemara asks the unanswered question about what happens when the collection is made La'achar Zman, is there a migu di boy omar patricha bismane? So we want to know what's the definition of La'achar Zman. But there are those, Reish Lakish is taking it, the נימוקי Yosef is taking a step back. When Reish Lakish says that a person is not believed to say I paid early, what exactly is the story? Heichi Maidi, how did this happen? When was the claim being made? The Gemara never defined that. The Gemara just said that a person isn't believed to say pay back early. But when is he being asked to pay? When is he being taken to Bezdin to pay up? So if Reuven is coming to ask Shimon, please pay up, and it's early, it's before the due date. How could the other guy say, I paid you early? Well, you're standing in early. So what do you mean I paid you early? Now is early. So it's like I don't know why he can't say I paid you last week, which is also early. But it seems like the נימוקי Yosef is trying to say that if I'm asking you early, then why is he even saying, well, I'm not sure. I don't see it in the words, but it could be what he means is, but it's actually the opposite. I thought he was going to say something like, why would I say anything? Well, I guess I'm saying I'm paid because I don't want to end up paying, right? I'm trying to get out of paying. So I'm getting out of paying by saying that I paid already. I guess what the נימוקי Yosef is saying is, by what right should you be believed to say you paid early? You are in early time. If it's late and you said you pay early, okay, so you have some sort of claim because the due date's over and I'm telling you I paid early, but we're still in the early. So what kind of claim is it you paid early? We're in the early. I'm not really sure. Anyway, what are you saying?
Like, what is it? Why he's just saying I paid already, right? Unless he's being precise, and I don't remember exactly what the wording of the Gemara is. If the wording of the Gemara is I paid early, then that wording doesn't fit if you're already in the early, right?
The wording is b'toich zmanai, within its time.
Right, but is that the wording that the borrower is actually said? Is the Gemara putting words in the borrower's mouth there?
Presumably, yeah.
So then you can't say I paid you early. That doesn't make sense if it's already early. That's not something he would respond
right
to the claim.
I understand, but why can't he say, look, I paid last week?
Right, but the Gemara says the Perek that that's what he responds.
Right, so maybe the answer. Okay, so I hear you. Are you saying that if it's in Zmanai, then he should have said Paraticha, I paid you, without saying Paraticha, Zmanai, because we're in Zmanai.
Yeah.
So you say Paraticha, I paid you. Yeah, I guess so. In other words, he's saying Paraticha, Zmanai in contrast to what he's being asked now, which now is the Achar Zmanai or Zmanai itself. Right?
Mm-hmm.
Unless he just should have said Paraticha, I paid you. We're still in Terzmane. Maybe.
Yeah. So the words, the wording of that the Gemara ascribes to him, if that's what he said, then it doesn't make sense if it's early still.
Right. He should have just said Particha, I paid you, because we're still within Terzmane. Okay, let's go with that. I hear that. Thank you. Now, so then this conundrum continues, right? So Rish Lakish could not be talking about a case where he's being asked to pay early, because his response is, I paid you early. We're already in early. Okay. So now, and if he's being asked to pay sometime after the due date, this is the Gemara's question later. Is there a migu when the person is being asked to pay late? So that couldn't be the case of Rish Lakish either. And therefore, for this reason, there are the people who disagree with the Ramban, they set up the case of Rish Lakish. He's asking him to pay on the due date. And that's why there's no migu. Because to say I paid you today is too bold. So this is the logic of those who disagree with the Ramban. So there's really 2 points to the opinion of those who oppose the Ramban. Point number 1 is the logic of it, which is it's too bold a lie to say I paid you this morning. Too bold a lie. And that's why there's no migu. Step 2 is, this is the only scenario in which Reish Lakish makes sense. Because if Reish Lakish is talking about a case where Reuven's coming to collect a month late, that's the Gemara's question later. And if Reish Lakish is talking about a case where the person came to collect early, then what kind of response is that I paid you early? We're in early. So it must mean that he came to ask him to pay on the due date, and the guy responds by saying, I paid you already early. Okay. But the Ramban disagrees with that. And the Ramban says, even if it's a bold claim to say I paid you today, it's nonetheless a claim that's available to him. And if it's a claim that's available to him, Reish Lakish should have outruled it explicitly. Because that's a greater chiddush than the claim that I paid you early in and of itself, without a migu, even if the migu is a bold one. So let's see how the נימוקי Yosef plays it out. Aval Ramban zal kosav, but the Ramban writes, Reish Lakish, that this case of Reish Lakish, the original case of the Gemara, where Reish Lakish says a person is not believed to say I paid early. So this is the Betava Begoizimne, when Shimon is coming to ask Reuven to pay early. Askinon, that's what we're dealing with. V'hu Omar, and he says, Kfar Praticha. So you see the wording, you're right, Adam, because you can see here that Ramban puts in the Ramban's wording, it's not Praticha but Teres Maneh, but Kfar Praticha, because we're already in Teres Maneh. So why would he say Praticha or Teres Maneh? So what does he say? He says, Praticha Kfar, I paid you already. Not I paid you in early, because we're still in early. I just paid you already last week. Even though that also was early, because I'm asking you early, and therefore if I said I paid you already, it's also early. And that's the case of Reish Lakish. So we have to change the wording of the Gemara. I think you're right here. It's a question of wording. The wording of the Gemara is Partich Teres Maneh. We are in Teres Maneh. What kind of claim is that? What kind of wording is that? But the Ramban is saying, oh, therefore must say that what he's saying is Particha Kfar, I paid you already. And both the claim and the counterclaim is Teres Maneh. And therefore, Abel Tova B'Yem de Meshalem Zimnei, if he comes to pay on the day of payment, on the due date, Kivan de Nemon Leimar Paraiti, because he could have said, I paid you this morning, even though it's a bold-faced lie, but because he could have made such a claim, and the Bezdin would have believed him, because as bold as it is. So Hainu buying the Tova Achas Maneh. This then is the Gemara's question of what happens. Is there a migo when a person collects after the time? It doesn't mean a month later. It means the second the time the due date's up, that day. Because even then he can make a migo. I paid you this morning. Just as he's believed, he would be believed to say after the time he's believed mishum migu. Because of the migo, I could have said I paid you on time. The same thing is true with the actual due date. He could say I paid you today. And therefore continues, this is now the explanation of the Gemara's question. The Gemara is asking, do we say Mali l'shaker? Do we say amigu? Why would I lie? Namely, certainly it must be true. The נימוקי Yosef is elucidating the migu. Certainly it must be true that when he claims that he paid early, because if he wanted to lie, it would be better off for him to say, I paid you on time. Which is a better claim, to Mehemen, but he would have been believed by. Therefore, we say the kushta ka'amar. He said the truth. Mehemen, and he's believed. This is the definition of a migu. Or on the other side of the coin, because there's a chazaka that a person never pays early. As we follow the chazaka. And we don't say that you could have made a better argument. And therefore he's not believed the chazaka because it's an absolute assumption. To part of because that a person would not pay early. The Talmuda like pashet heich baya. And the Gemara does not give us a conclusion as to what the halacha is in this case. So what's the halacha? It says that נימוקי Yosef, because of Hardivsal, the Rif writes, the Chol ki hai gavna, anything in such a situation, I guess a unresolved question of dinei mominus, of questions of monetary claims and counterclaims, then you go l'chumr l'teveya, you put the stringency on the person making the claim, the kula l'nitva, and you go light on the person who is being asked to pay. That is to say, the money stays right where it is. Hilchach, therefore, concludes that if mishtabash v'us heses the paray or mifter. Therefore, this is an added din which the Gemara does not say explicitly. It's a chiddush din. Therefore, Shimon, who claims I paid early, should take a shvuas heses. It's a rabbinic shvua, not a shvua deraisa, that he paid already and he can walk off. But he has to take that shvuas heses. This is a din. The truth is the Gemara didn't resolve the issue at all. But the Rabban is saying that in this halacha where you leave the money where it is, I guess because of the weakness of the claim that he paid early, Shimon has to take a shvuas heses, at least a shvuah d'Rabbanan, that he actually paid early, and then he goes off scot-free. Then did a timer, and it would seem to me, says נימוקי Yosef, that the reason for the rif is time of the milsa. The reason for this halacha, lazeh for this halacha, shezeh klal gadol b'din, because this is the general rule of all of Torah. Hamoitzi mechavayda alav araya, the one who extracts money, the burden of proof is on him, and therefore we have to be more machmer on the one making the claim, because the burden of proof is on him. And if the Gemara leaves it unresolved, then that's what we do: leave it unresolved and leave the money exactly where it is. But it's still a chiddush din that he has. Sorry.
How does that fit with the chazaka that you don't pay early?
So, lapoil, you're stuck. You can't win, because if you go the other way, then if you say he's not believed that he paid, then you're giving Migu more power. If you're saying that he is believed, if you're saying you believe that he paid, you're giving the chazaka, you're giving the Migu more power than the chazaka. So either way you go, you're stuck. And when you're stuck, you leave the money right where it is. It's a default position. It's not a positive position. Right. We have no choice. It so happens that the default position favors the person who has the money in his hands.
Yeah.
Even though it's counter to the chazaka. We don't have a choice. I guess the chazaka is maybe that's why he has to take a shvuah, because it's such a bold claim that's against the chazaka. We're going to make you take a shvuah. Maybe. And what happens if he doesn't take the shvuah? Then he has to pay up. Even though money is being extracted from him. It's a default position. It's actually quite often, and when you learn Rambam, it's quite often.
And the Rambam, he says you take a shavua to protect the whole idea of loans. People wouldn't give loans if there was no shavus heses to force somebody so he can just walk away.
Right. That's generally speaking that we want to make a shavus heses yeah. We want to make it. We don't want to make it too easy for people to get out of paying back. Yeah. So that would apply here too. Yeah, I guess that logic applies here too. So that's a default position on both ends. It's a default position that we don't take money out of and it's also a default position that we don't want to make it easy for a person to get out of paying. I guess they're two default positions. Yeah, that makes sense. Okay, next page in the top of the נימוקי Yosef. So we're seeing in the Gemara. We learn in the Gemara. This is the last clause in the Gemara, where a person said, "Manu li biyadcha." One person says, "You owe me $100." V'Allah omer, and the other person says, "Hey, yes, I indeed owe you $100." And there are witnesses who testify to this effect that Shimon agreed that he owes Reuven $100. The next day, Amar le, Reuven comes to Shimon and says, "Tanuhu li pay me." Now Shimon responds by saying, "Look, I paid you already. Potter is exempt. Peter is Potter, meaning he's Potter, but nonetheless, for the reasons that the Moshe just mentioned, it's the same reason that Moshe just said. Now, however, if Shimon agreed in front of Adam, yes, indeed, I owe you money. And the next day he says, I paid you already. So his claim the next day that he says, I paid you is not a contradiction to his agreement yesterday that he owes him money. It's just the next step. I paid you back already. And if because there's no contradiction, he believed he has to make a shvuah and whatever. But if he says, Ein lach b'yadi, if he says, I don't owe you anything, chayav, he's obligated to pay. The Gemara asks, my Ein lach b'yadi, what does this mean? I don't owe any. What does it mean when he says, I don't owe you anything? And the Gemara concludes, first the Gemara suggests maybe it means I paid you up, or I paid already. And the Gemara tries to prove from here with respect to the question of Particha Teres Manin. And the Gemara concludes and says no. What it means when he says I don't owe you anything, what it means is the Amar Lo Hayom Advar Ma'olam. It means he says it never happened. And because it says it never happened, this is a contradiction to what he said yesterday in front of Aiden that he does owe. And the Gemara concluded, anyone who says, I never borrowed, it's as if he says I didn't pay. And therefore, it's a contradiction to what he said yesterday. Yeah, so we saw from Rashi and from Tosafos trying to figure out exactly why the Gemara is introducing this last statement. Seemingly the very fact that it's a contradiction is enough not to believe in. But nonetheless, the Gemara says that what undergirds this contradiction is the fact that anyone who makes the claim that I never borrowed, it's as if he says I never paid. And therefore, yesterday when he acknowledged that he borrowed, and today by him saying I never borrowed, what he's really saying is I never paid. And thus we go back to what he said yesterday, which is he borrowed and he still owes. So let's see. Because he didn't borrow, Pshita obviously the para, they never paid. Now, Upirshim Mafarshim Zal, the Mafarshim said, this is back to the issue of Tosafos that we just mentioned. The Balav Hachi Taima, even without this reasoning of Kol Lavisi Kilo Amar Le Paraiti, Nami Pshita Lem Hamnin. It's also quite obvious that he's not believed. Why? We've already acknowledged in the presence of two witnesses by saying, yes, I owe you money. And now, is it not acceptable to say it never happened? You said yesterday that it did happen. Now you're coming and saying it never happened. What kind of thing is that? So what do we have? Why this is this question, and it seems that Rashi is also dealing with this question as we saw the whole complicated language in Rashi. So why does the Gemara have to resort to the logic? Seemingly, the very fact that he's contradicting himself is enough to say he's not believed. Yesterday he said he did borrow money, and today he's saying never happened. So explains that in נימוקי Yosef, but here, the Gemara adds this reasoning to teach us that even if witnesses were to come, and they were to say, Shalova upara, that he borrowed and paid, Chayav, he is obligated. Right? You'll remember from Tosafos introduced us to the Gemara in Shavuos. The Gemara in Shavuos, which is the original statement, the original place where the statement is made, and there Tosafos said that the statement, the case is where a person says, I never borrowed. Adim come and say, we saw that you borrowed and we saw that you paid. So Tosafos said that the Gemara in Shavuos says, when Shimon said, I never borrowed, we split that into two. He's saying two things. I never borrowed, and he's saying I never paid. Because now that's the case. As for the question of him saying I never borrowed, we have Adim that say you did borrow. As for the fact that the Adim say you paid, well, you just said you didn't pay, so you got to pay. And that's where the logical dummy. And Tosafos said that case is different from our case. But the נימוקי Yosef is merging the two. And the נימוקי Yosef is saying that no, is added here in the Gemara to say that even if the Adim who told us yesterday that Shimon agreed that he owes, even if those same Adim come along and tell us that Shimon paid up, we still would make him pay because now, why would I not say that? And we don't read into his words, to say, this is what it means when he says, when he says it never happened, we shouldn't say that it means, that I borrowed, and I didn't pay, when he means to say when he says never happened, what he means to say is, it never happened that I borrowed and didn't pay, but rather I borrowed and paid. Your claim that I borrowed and never paid, that didn't happen. So when he says it never happened, he doesn't mean it never happened that I didn't borrow. He means that it never happened that I borrowed and didn't pay, because I did pay. And that's a way of touching it into his words. It's similar, but not exactly like Tosafos. Tosafos said that what you could have typed into his words is, it says, if I didn't borrow. Why is it as if I didn't borrow? Because I paid. It's a little bit different here, where he says that your claim that I borrowed and never paid back, that never happened. Whereas Tosafos says, it's as if it never happened because I paid. It amounts to the same conclusion, but the wording and what we're reading into his statement is a little bit slightly different. I'm not sure if you can notice the difference. Right? Either he's saying, it's as if it never happened because I paid already, or like נימוקי Yosef is saying, your claim that I borrowed and didn't pay, that never happened. Why did it never happen? Because I paid. Right? It never happened such a thing that I borrowed and didn't pay back because I paid. Okay. But for some reason, this alone is not good enough for the נימוקי Yosef. And he says that the case is still when the Eidim say that he paid also. I mean, Tosafos doesn't need to say that. Tosafos just says the case in Shavuos is where the Eidim say you borrowed and paid. And that's why we have the laws of Kol Eimer Levi Shelo Kol Eimer Leparati. Why do we have it here? We have it here, not the taich, that it says if it never happened. Okay. But the נימוקי Yosef combines both. He says our Gemara is also talking about, is also coming to Bavaran to forewarn a case where the Eidim say you borrowed and paid. And why is that? Because Lo Yehar Dvar Ma'olam means that I never borrowed and didn't pay. He combines both, which is interesting. Is that clear? I'm not sure if that was clear, that other distinction between the נימוקי Yosef and the Tosafos. Kind of clear? Yeah, okay. V'arozal, right there in the נימוקי Yosef, v'arozal, Pirush. The Ra touches like this. The Acha, that here, when the Gemara adds this final statement, this is what the Gemara wants to teach us. Dafilu Amar, even if he said, Ein lach biyadi, I don't owe you anything. After he said, I paid you. So he said two things. Well, let's just go through the whole story. Reuven tells Shimon in front of Eidim, you owe me money. Shimon says, yes, I do, indeed. Then later Shimon says, I paid you. And then after that, Shimon says, I don't owe you anything. I don't owe you anything. So now, it's much more likely to assume that the second statement where he says, I don't owe you anything, is because I paid you. Because I actually made the claim, Masativ, I paid you. He made two claims. He says, first, I paid you. And then he says, I don't owe you anything. Nonetheless, Chayev is still Chayev. Why? Don't assume. Because his first claim was, I paid you. Which is the same, this amounts to the same thing as Praiticha, I paid you. So therefore, and therefore, when he continues and says, I don't owe you anything, this is what he means. I don't owe you anything. Because I already paid. Kamash Malan comes a massive chiddush from the Gemara and says, from the Ra, anyone who says I never borrowed, it's as if he says I didn't pay. So if he says, I paid you, and then he goes on to say, I don't owe you anything. In that I don't owe you anything, what he's really doing is he's retracting his statement that I paid you. Because by saying I don't owe you anything, what he's saying is the loan never happened. And if he's saying the loan never happened, it's as if he's saying he never paid back. And therefore he's retracting his original statement of Nasativ. This is a massive chiddush. And therefore, it's as if he's going back and retracting and saying, I didn't pay you. Where in that case, Chayiv is obligated to pay. Major chiddush. Because the logic is very sound. First I said I paid you. And then I said, I don't owe you anything. Yeah, I don't owe you anything because yesterday I told you I paid you. Says the Ra, no, you ruined your statement. By saying you don't owe anything, you're falsifying the loan. And if you're falsifying the loan, then that's you retracting your statement that you paid. It's as if you're saying now I didn't pay. And therefore you're chayav. Major chiddush. And concludes in נימוקי Yosef, I'm not into making papulim, but mishum dinim elu hayotzim mahai grora kasafti. Because of the halachas that come out of this discussion, this big chiddush from the Ra. And even the first one, the chiddush of if Eidim come and say you borrowed and paid, but you claim you never borrowed, you're still chayev, because that's one chiddush, which is really the chiddush of the Gemara and Shavuos. And then the second chiddush of the Ra, that even if a person claims and says, I paid, and then he goes and says, I don't owe you anything, that I don't owe you anything undermines the statement earlier that he paid. Therefore, says, for this reason, Tosafos, therefore I wrote these dinim. Okay, the next part is really going to get to the next sugya. So I think we're going to stop over here because we don't have enough time really to begin the Gemara. So maybe next week we'll start the next sugya fresh. The sugya where the Gemara analyzes the second half of the Mishnah, the second clause, which is the amas that are above 4 amas, and when exactly the other person is chayiv to pay. And we're going to get into all kinds of scenarios of neighbors that have roofs near each other and walls near each other when they're obligated to pay for these shared assets. Okay, I'm good enough.
Yeah, good enough.